Hi, my name is Amber Ginter. I am a teacher at Unioto High School. I teach English to 10th grade, so sophomores. This is my second year in the RESA program. So hopefully, I can answer all the questions that I would normally answer in the presentation through this video. So, I am going to be talking about the formative and summative assessments in To Kill a Mockingbird. So I decided to start this unit right before Christmas break. And then when we got back, we kind of had some snow days on and off. So the unit lasted for a little bit over a month. We finished in early February. So to start off, I'm going to be using the forms that we were required to fill out for this PowerPoint. So I'm going to address the teaching and learning context as well as the instructional unit. So basically, the class that I teach is regular sophomore English. And so I usually have half females, half males, predominantly white for race, with a wide range of low, medium, and high, as well as talented and gifted and IEP 504 students. I do teach in a normal classroom, so there are desks, smartboard, whiteboard, chalkboard. I use those daily. And like I said, I teach English 10. It's regular, not advanced, to sophomores at UHS. This unit was specifically chosen for its diverse range of controversial topics as a classic text, basically because of the accessibility and relatability to students. If you are familiar with To Kill a Mockingbird, it definitely deals with the issue of racism, segregation, which is really relevant in today's society, especially with all the riots going on. Black Lives Matter, super applicable to our students. And my students in particular found that really interesting when we started the unit. The final learning outcomes at the end, shared in the presentation, explain formative summative checkpoints throughout the unit's entirety. And so the alignment of these methods are monitored throughout using adaptability and accommodations as needed, which you will see through students A, B, and C. So, as explained on the next few slides, formative assessment 1 was going to be a question check, as well as formative assessment 2. And then I actually listed quite a few additional 3 summative assessments. So I did a pop quiz before the weekly test, and then I also showed a final project and test. So, as a larger part of my unit for my journals and for these forms, I wanted to kind of show you some different tabs to go through the lesson. So every day when I teach, if I can open this so you can see it, every day when I teach, I put up a agenda on the board, and so the students are clearly able to see the learning target. They're able to see their bell ringer journal that directly correlates with the lesson, some reminders, the date, and then all the materials that we'll be using. They have access to this on Google Classroom as well, where I load everything. So, if you look at our lesson today, on that day, we were on chapter 15. We looked at the journal. What do you think Atticus means when he says he's in favor of Southern womanhood as much as anybody, but not for preserving polite fiction at the expense of human life? How could his comments relate to Tom Robinson's court case? This is getting at a little bit deeper level cognitive thinking other than just, tell me what the chapter was about. We're trying to connect the ideas in the novel as a whole for segregation, racism, discrimination, the difference between how whites were treated as opposed to African Americans. We then went over their vocab words for the week, and so they were on 16 through 19. They had an assignment due, so they were to turn that in. That's what the blackout poetry is. We then completed a worksheet as a class analyzing poetry for chapters 14 through 15. And then normally we would end these classes with unit questions. So we looked at chapter 16, 17, note taking chart, comprehension check questions. This lesson covered RL 9 to 10.1, 9 to 10.2, 9 to 10.10, writing 9 to 10.10, for language 9 to 10.3 and 10.6, and RI was 10.2, 3, and 5. And so I always list those on the board in ways that the students can understand, so the student should be able to. You can read over these, pause the video. It tells you all the information that I covered. Their vocab words came from the list here. always gives them what they need, and then at the end of the week, they are assessed on those. They are given a fill in the blank without a word bank, and they are also quizzed on the chapters that we read for that week. Um, and you can see that here, as well as the worksheet that we looked at that day for analyzing poetry. So if we take a specific look at this lesson that I taught in January, the content focus is what we're going to hit first, and that was to analyze poetry that was noted in chapters 14 and 15 and related to the core development of chapters 16 through 17 that were then scaffolded upon using key themes, ideals, motifs. And we can kind of see that if we look at the worksheet. You can notice it gives a great introduction about the Civil War, how slaves were officially freed, but really they didn't have that freedom still. We know that they were still highly discriminated against. And so this used some works from the United States of a author to be able to compare that. And then these questions not only analyze the poems, but those final connections to the novel, how life was difficult for African Americans, maybe why Hughes wrote this surrounding the Tom Robinson case, and then they were given an extra credit opportunity. So from that, you can see our learning outcomes from not only that worksheet, but also what was shared here on the slide. Were that the students should be able to analyze two poems by Langston Hughes, interpret the poems, how they directly relate to overall themes, ideals, motifs of the new and the old To Kill a Mockingbird chapters explored in class. They should use academic language, reflect on prior knowledge gained through scaffolding, share ideas through written and verbal communication. And by the end of the lesson, students will be able to identify what each poem is about and relate that to those questions and chapters that they read and answered. And so the central focus and key learning outcomes definitely represent rigorous learning and discipline with high expectations. I've preached that to my students since the beginning of the year that, I'm not going to accept work that is not excellent work, to the best that you can give me. And so this definitely represents that because I start with a daily journal that directly relates to the lesson. You can see that in the prompt. I use scaffolding, differentiation through completing a poem together. We use small and large groups. We use verbal assessment, independent practice with a partner individually. And that kind of explores their comprehension skills, not only with me, but with a partner and individually and as a class. So students must have read the novel to actively participate. It's very blatantly clear when a student starts saying, well, it was racist because it was racist, and that doesn't really explain anything or tell me that they read the novel. And high standards are required daily with the procedures, the appropriate levels of there's a zone of proximal development based on their skills and their tasks. Again, I kind of went over this earlier, but the school district priorities or state national content, these were addressed by the reading, discussing of the poems, answering questions that reflected academic rigor and writing skills, themes, story elements that directly connected to the novel. They answered a journal, they connected ideas across concepts. And so they were able to cite that evidence from the poem and use theme details to relate to the chapter questions and audio. So that's referring to I gave them the option sometimes to listen and found this wonderful website that a fellow teacher told me about where we could really listen to the audio. And it's amazing. It does a really great job at narrating it with authenticity. And so here again, this is kind of what I put up there for the students, but they should be able to cite textual evidence explicitly and infer. They should be able to identify themes, story elements, read, comprehend literature at grade level, build and activate that background knowledge, prior knowledge. So we've talked about the Great Depression, segregation, racism. They should be able to write over time, write and edit, have academic language, look at the text theme impacted, summary, central ideas, sequence of ideas over time with the analysis, and the author's ideas that are involved in media. So I want to briefly explain how I plan to differentiate instruction for the students. So we had to choose A, B, and C. And so normally I do this by scaffolding tasks, analyzing each class's ZPD, which may differ drastically. My first period has numerous IEP 504s, whereas I have classes that have much higher intellectual thinkers. And so that would be addressed in a different manner. So, for example, some classes required more help, others took the lead. Some classes we read the poem together, others read independently or with a partner. And so, having that flexibility really reveals that differentiation based on the skill set, the student understanding, and really just adapting to what the students need, what's best for them. One size does not fit all when it comes to differentiating between students and classrooms. So, like I noted during first period, I had to help some struggling readers, worked with an aide, worked with them myself. And so we did that with scaffolding support, mixed grouping, small, large groups. For my students A, B, and C particularly, I differentiated using one on one instruction, outside of class help, supplemental notes, worksheets, and then analyzing the assessments that were formative as we went along to adapt that for the summative ones. And so we're going to be looking at that. But basically, student A really struggled at the beginning with just even turning in work. And they were normally a great student. And so that's where I took that one on one approach. Whereas student B really just needed more pulled out of their shell to be bold, to share things. Student C had really high expectations, high work that they turned in quality wise. And so they were often needed to, work on more behavioral problems or even just pushing them higher to their limits. And I will explain that in the next few slides. So, in this instructional unit, this lesson in particular was 46 minutes, but the entire unit takes 8 to 12 weeks. And so each lesson is scaffolded from the lesson that I chose for reflection. And so, like I said, the unit started in December and ended in early February, mainly due to the breaks and snow days. So, when during the instructional unit did each of these assessments take place? I give numerous formative and summative assessments daily, weekly, but for that particular lesson in January, the pop quiz summative was given the next day, preceded by the formative assessment of discussion and journal prompts. And so that means when I gave my assignments, which I will show you those, um, they would get questions that they would have while they read the chapter. So if they paid attention, they literally could just fill them out as we went along, they go in order. And so they were given those. The next day, they took a pop quiz. The day after that, they took the second formative assessment, another set of questions. And every week follows that same pattern. And then at the end of the week, they're always quizzed on those vocab words that they were given Monday. We usually do a worksheet and talk about it. And then that test not only was on vocab, but also on the theme, the poem, anything that we read with those questions. They were 100% taken from that. And so that really adequately prepares them. And I'll share that in the results. But if they didn't do the questions, they're probably not going to do well in the test because it's definitely scaffolding and preparing them for those details. So for both formative assessment one and two, I kind of put the same thing, but discussion questions and conversations in both small, large group settings allowed students to express what they understood, that what they read, they could connect that across content, for example, racism of a poem to the racism of the novel. And then the questions, like I said, that they did always reflected those conversations in class, or we discussed it, we read the chapter, writing over time. And really, my rationale behind that is definitely building that scaffolding. And so, discussions, rather they're in class or through the questions as small and large groups, definitely reveal the importance of learning in the context of the whole unit. And so, for example, with looking at hues and that poem, they could reveal the racism and then relate that to the terms and themes in the novel as a whole. And that overall knowledge would, develop their ideas over time. Same with the journals. I give a lot of small stakes assessments that reflect growth. I use a lot of thumbs up, thumbs down, participation checks for those questions, participation checks for, hey, like, guys, let's review. Can you tell me what Hugh's poem was about at the end of class? Starting at the beginning with, getting that inquiry. Do you know who Hughes is? What is racism? What is segregation? What is discrimination? So here as a whole, I wanted to show you the materials that I was able to use. And so I'm going to pull this up. I used a program called Secondary Solutions. It is fantastic. It is one of the best resources that I have found. And I'll just, kind of show you. I love how it lays out all the information for you. I kind of took it and, put my own twist on it, but you can definitely see this is where I got the information to share with the students. Um, Let me show you just an example of the questions. So they always have these note-taking summarizing boxes that I have them complete, but then they also are given questions. So like here's the chapter 1. But for this particular unit, if we go to the 14 and 15, let's see. They go to the 14 and 15, you can see the worksheets for that section. So they clearly ask questions to give you a check of understanding. That was my first formative assessment. Here you can see the worksheet we did in class. Following that, we looked at the vocab in class. That was a different day. 16, 17, there are those additional questions, and so on and so forth. So, like I said, every Monday I assign vocab and chapter reading questions that were reviewed formatively using the worksheets, discussions, and journals I just showed you. And then summatively on Friday's quiz, they had either matching words or fill in the blank with or without a word bank, and then comprehension and extended response or short answer questions as a essay option might also pop up. And so, leading up to that, like I just showed you, every day would consist of reading, review, heads up, heads down, thumbs up, thumbs down, tons of formative review, as well as, summative pop quizzes and analyzing each of the formatives as we went along through that larger summative at the end. In the following slides, I'm going to do my best to show you the examples of that formative summative given throughout the unit, as well as analyzing that for A, B, and C students, i.e. P504 accommodations, or even additional circumstances that popped up during my teaching. So I've already kind of reviewed this, and you can just pause the video and read over this if you would like. But again, I'm just reviewing the formative summative assessments that were given. I also included in my presentation the overall final summative, just so you could see that growth over time progress from one of the very first few weeks questions and pop quiz to the very very end where we had a final project, final essay, final test. And so one particular example, would be I gave a pop quiz and lesson highlighting hypocrisy, for example. And so that topic and segregation, racism were covered in that first lesson that I gave. It was covered in pre-assessment anticipation guide, introductions, worksheets, and tests. And then, at the end, I was able to give that final test essay question project essay that all asked about hypocrisy. And so that's just one example without showing you. So let me make this bigger. So our 3 students, okay? And student A did perform low on the question check. They did not read the chapter. So when I show you their materials in a bit, you'll see a blank sheet, and that would be because they didn't do it. By formative assessment 2, they did not complete those questions either. They were able to discuss with peers, but it definitely was evident they hadn't read the chapters and they did not understand the content. And so those journals lacked a lot of racial insight. They avoided discussions or gave just general responses. By the end middle of that week, they did pass the pop quiz. They received an 8 out of 10. The comprehension, they received a 35 out of 40. Although they definitely did not do the vocabulary test well, they got a 7 out of 20. They failed to complete those questions, like I said, in the formative assessments prior, which is surprising that they received that 35 here, just because those are the same questions. So at least they must have been paying attention when we went over those as a class. Um, they also didn't really, comprehend it super well prior to that. They did do the class worksheet in class, the poetry, and an additional worksheet. They got below average on that final summative test, 73 and a half. out of 122, whereas the project, they really pulled it off. They used 193 points. Student B did complete the questions and was able to discuss findings, but they definitely lacked deeper understanding and insight. Formative 2, they were able to discuss with their peers. Their journal had some knowledge of racism, segregation, good participation, showed some insight and improvement in writing. And they did pass their quiz with a 10 out of 10, their comprehension of 40 out of 40, and their vocab 16 out of 20, which was pretty average. That showed mild general understanding. And so, though they lacked, they completed those questions, they did lack some understanding, either because they didn't study for this vocab test, or maybe they just had some difficulty understanding those when the format was presented. They actually did really great on their summative. They got 122 points. Their final project, as we can see, they got 188 out of 200. And then student C, we see that high because remember, student A was low, student B mid, student C high. They did complete all the questions and the question check. They had really rich understanding, deep development topics. Same for the second set of questions. They could discuss that with those formative assessment questions, small and large group discussions. They helped their peers. The journals were superior in growth and intellect, connecting the standards to the theme and ideas covered in class. They passed their quiz with an 8 out of 10. They had the 16 to 19 comp and vocab test were exempted because unfortunately student C was out due to COVID. They also failed to complete that in-class worksheet, but they did complete the final test and project with almost perfect scoring of 120 on the test and 190 on the project. They definitely excellently performed on all methods of assessment, and they received the full credit on those assignments that they did complete. And I will quickly show you those. I know that we're supposed to hand out copies, but I am not there in person with you. So I made a copy of student A. Again, you can see they did not complete. I wrote that there for you, but they were able to participate in the discussions. So we have a blank, you know, blank questions because they didn't complete those. That's a worksheet they did do in class. That's not one that everybody, that I assessed really. Here's the second formative assessment that's blank that they didn't do. So definitely low performing. Here's their pop quiz. They got an 8 out of 10. You can see clearly what they got wrong. Here was that weekly quiz where they definitely did not study. And this definitely shows that self-assessment because I do a trade-in grade process, not for the larger tests, but for the small pop quizzes. So they'll trade in grade and immediately get feedback from time to time. I'd also grade these that way. You can see their understanding wasn't um, too fair. It was pretty decent. They were able to, restate. They kind of just didn't fill that one in. And this is that big, big test. So you can tell, again, uh, they wrote their answers on a separate sheet, but they really did not do well on that vocab, which is coming back to bite them. And then they kind of missed some crucial details, not super difficult. They were able to get that theme about judgment, segregation. And then their project, like I said, here's their rubric for both the essay and project, and they did a really great job. I thought that they understood it well. I gave them immediate feedback. Here's their song choices. They did a great job. Comparatively, let's see, student B, and I'll just quickly go through these so you can see that I have them on here. Student B, here's their questions. They lacked a little bit of insight, how's the arrangement in courtrooms different than modern courtrooms? It isn't segregated. That's kind of general and bland, not super insightful. They progressed a little bit here once we talked about concepts in class, getting more specific. Their pop quiz, where they got a 10 out of 10. There's their vocab. There's the reflection of those comp. Final test, where they got a perfect score. And there's their final project. Did really, really great on that. And finally, student C, you will see is lacking one of those worksheets. That's why I didn't include that as an assessment method that I looked at, just because all 3 students needed to have the same assessments, and they just did not do that due to COVID. They wrote their questions separately, had really rich insight, pop quiz, test. They only missed 1 question, even for being absent. These were exempted due to COVID. They had a discussion with me, and then they had their essay portion with their project included here with their essay, which directly correlated, like I mentioned earlier, either racism, segregation, or hypocrisy. So that kind of gives you a brief overview. Like I said, that self-assessment was really given all the time through that training grade. I would check their questions, I'd check specifically, read over them, turn them in. Sometimes I would do daily questions. I would do parts of the assessment to help them understand their progress, questions on the homework. And so they were definitely given ample time to study and prepare. So what does that mean? Student A, according to assessment scores, performed low. They didn't read the chapter in that first assessment. Though they could discuss the questions, they lacked a lot of deep, rich insight. Things like I said would say, "Well, they're racist because of segregation." Like, well, that doesn't that doesn't really give me specifics. So their next steps, I worked with them individually outside of class. I changed their placement in the classroom. And I also just asked them to put away their headphones, their earbuds, and stop listening to music. Student B, I really, thought that they completed their questions well, but they just lacked that higher level thinking. And so for student B, their next steps were I was able to really push them. And so I did that by prodding for more information. I would ask for that. I would note that, hey, student B had an excellent understanding of this question. Would you like to share? And that really, kind of boosted that confidence and paid off later. Student C had a thorough understanding. A lot of the time, they were a jokester and didn't want to appear smart. And so I really had to push and prod them to not goof off. I talked with them outside of class to show their peers, hey, like, you're really smart. You need to just show your peers how to do that, how to engage. And so they started calming down and actually sharing their answers, helping others, and they really benefit from that. So I benefited that by giving them, that praise that they might need, pushing them, giving them those higher level questions when I went around and worked with them individually. And that really helped them to reach that higher level of ZPD. In the second assessment, very similar. Again, student A didn't complete those, and so they had minimal insight in the discussions and the questions. Again, I clarified questions that they were stuck on. I met with them outside of class. I did learn that they were absent and sick during one of the completion of the questions, and so they were just really anxious and worried. And so they did complete makeup recovery, which I usually don't give, and they did progress over time. Student B, again, showed that thorough understanding, and they started really showing great growth and development. And so they progressed through a natural phase of scaffolding. They really benefited from that direct instruction and encouragement. I always made sure to comment, hey, that was a great answer, number one, or hey, like, what do you really think about that? Also, asking them outside of class about their personal lives really helps solidify that as well, or relate the topics to what they're going through. And student C, on that second question set, same as the first. They did fail to do one of the worksheets, not the main formative assessments, but one of them, and that was actually due to COVID. They were just not feeling well that day. And then, of course, the next day was when they just didn't show up for the next 2 weeks because of COVID. And so they were a great asset in class, and my next instructions with them were definitely individualized feedback on questions, writing assignments. They had to be allocated extra time due to that, due to COVID. They got personalized feedback. They got to work with me outside of class and really just push them those deeper levels. For student A, basically their assessment results showed that based on the 3 assessments, they made a regular progression. They performed poorly on assessments 1 and 2, and they lacked some higher skills in that final summative test, but their project actually really pulled through. So they did a great job, but they still lack some insight. They completed the assignments. But, like I said, they had a little bit of sickness and were stressed out. So that's where I worked with them one on one, used scaffolding with incentives. They do not have special needs, but I did meet with my mentor and staff members to see what I could do. And they said that, that supplemental and scaffolding, I was doing all that I could. Over the course of the unit, they grew in maturity and insight. Though they didn't complete the formative questions, they did complete the additional worksheet, test, and project. And they actually, like I said, made makeup allocation due to COVID and did complete those questions with me later on. They used Quizlet and they worked with me outside of class. With all considerations in mind, I, wanted to learn more about them, and since this time I have, and they've really taken well to that. They've had a lot more effort and drive in my class, and so, going forward, I've noted that meeting with this student works great outside of class and giving detailed feedback. So again, overall, they originally performed low on both, and then at the end, their reflective scores are shown. For student B, they made a normal amount of progress with overall development for medium range. They gained traction when completing the questions, but then at the summative, they often froze a little bit. Within the first few formative assessments, we see that because by the summative, they clearly connect some material but disconnect others. So, for example, they did great on the questions, those first formative assessments, but then they didn't study the vocab. And I mean, they did, but they still missed a few. And so I talked with them about, "Hey, did you not study?" "Yeah, sorry, I got tired." And I really was able to encourage them and motivate them. And then definitely their superb performance on that final test really impressed me due to COVID and sickness. And like I said, their final project also revealed that they had great insight into racial segregation. These definitely impacted my next steps for them, and so going forward, I knew that the student would benefit from practice worksheets, partner work studying, which I could utilize in and out of class. They do well with participation, hands-on materials, and then definitely just general reminders and encouragement. And again, you can review their formative assessments and summative scores here. Finally, student C had made exceptional progress beyond higher skills necessary to complete advanced understanding. Unlike student A and B, they needed to be pushed past that ZPD through scaffolding and differentiation different than the other students. So even though they did fail to complete one worksheet, which, like I said, I think they were sick that day, and then COVID kind of struck them, they did have a rich insight and understanding. Their journals, or their questions and worksheets really revealed that summative growth by the end. And so they might benefit from those extension assignments, like where I would come by and say, well, actually, how about we add this to your question? Can you answer that for me? Even if other students did not take note of that. Like I said, for the next steps, I knew that that was harder. But I did think about assigning different book selections going forward or additional materials, and supplemental worksheets, podcast videos, challenge assignments. Again, you can review those details here. I did want to just give you a very specific example. Here's that journal entry where we can really just pause and take a moment to look at this very general view of A, B, and C. So if you notice, they're talking about a journal entry here. And so he means that no human life is worth preserving. You should do what you can to live your life, defend those accused of doing wrong. I think Atticus means everyone should be equal. It was a special occasion. If you want to pause and look over those. Again, we've already reviewed all of those assessments. And so finally, one last assessment that I wanted to go over was a student that could not read a graphic novel. And so I had to give kind of a special case for this. And so basically, what I had to do was completely redo what they were going to do in class. And so what I did is that their journal really related To Kill a Mockingbird, but also applied that to the book near Dear Martin. So I had the same quote, and then how could his comments relate to the incident with Mello and Jess? Can relate because in the beginning of Dear Martin, Justice was judged for doing something bad just because of the color of his skin. You can see that we were going for the same ideas. I can show you those here with the alternative plan that they were given. Can just see they had similar assignments, certain days, and then additional ones. Here they were given to annotate, and the student would list examples underneath of the student, or underneath of the teacher example, the student would put theirs. And this student really reflected excellent understanding of racism and segregation by the end. This was their final assessment that was different than everyone else's, as well as their daily, weekly journal entries. So, all in all, that is my formative summative assessments in To Kill a Mockingbird, and I hope that that answers all of your questions. It is a great unit to teach, and I highly recommend it. Thanks. I hope you have a great day.